things I think we have as a stereotype about communist governments in Eastern Europe is this idea that they had really expansive welfare states. And in fact, this is one thing that they really boasted about in the 20th century, is that they protected their citizens from the cradle to the grave. This was one of their great big claims. And their propaganda frequently focused on this. It frequently said that Western capitalist societies were very callously uninterested in improving the plight of society's most socioeconomically vulnerable people. That included the elderly, the disabled, single mothers, people like this. And yet in practice, as I've seen in my own research, and as I write about it in the book that is coming out soon, Soviet-style welfare regimes were very exclusionary and paternalistic in practice. And in fact, they really linked the receipt of monetary benefits in particular to productivity considerations. So in other words, people who gave more of their labor to the regime and sort of demonstrably showed their commitment to building communism were entitled to more of the regime's welfare benefits. This is how it worked in practice. Although what they called it was never this, they called it care. The word in Russian is zabota. This is the word they used all the time in describing this. So in my talk today, what I want to do is explore the Soviet pension system and the fraught process of its creation. So I'm going to try to give you a kind of down and dirty explanation of how it all came to be, and also talk a little bit toward the end of the talk about some of the legacies that this Soviet approach to pension policy has kind of left behind for post-communist governments. So I think as it'll become clear, getting a pension in the Soviet Union was not a guarantee. In fact, the entire pension policy prior to 1956, when you had the substantive reform that I'm going to talk about, was very fragmented. It was very industry specific, and it was extremely exclusionary. Lots and lots of people were left out of this system. For the vast majority of the Soviet period, getting a pension was a reward much more than it was a right. And as I said before, this approach to doing this is really going to set up some of the problems that we see as the Soviet Union collapses, but also when we transition to a capitalist economy after 1991. So although the Bolsheviks came to power promising that they would have, oh, this is not letting me go forward, there we go. They came to power promising that they would have a very substantial, a very comprehensive social welfare system, they lacked resources to do this. The priority for them in the very beginning was just getting the economy up and going. And so it took them about 10 years after the revolution to get a pension policy in place. So in fact, it's not a Leninist innovation, it's 100% a Stalinist innovation, the policies that I'm going to talk about today. So the first pensions are paid out in 1927, and they go to workers in the textile industry, and then they're sort of slowly rolled out to other to other categories of pensioners, to other industries over the course of the 5-year plan. But the main thing I want to emphasize here is that this pension policy, it evolved in a very piecemeal way. There was no kind of central top-down approach to this. So the pensions that are given out, they vary wildly by type of job, by industry, by the grounds upon which a pension recipient is given the pension. You have one kind of major central policy, however, which is set in 1930, which is that the government sets the minimum retirement age, and it sets it at age 60 for men and 55 for women, in both cases having achieved a labor period, the stage is the word they use in Russian, of 25 years for men and 20 years for women. This requirement is going to be, this policy is going to be in place until 2018. So this law's on the books for like 90 years. This is the age of retirement in Russia. And when they try to change it in 2018, it provokes an enormous amount of discontent and unrest. And I'll come to that toward the end of the talk. So the other law that they set during this pivotal, this foundational moment is a law that caps workers' pensions at a percentage of a 300 ruble amount. So without getting too technical about this, the way it worked was that depending on the industry that you were in, you would get a percentage of your wages up to 300 rubles. So some people would get 100% and they would get the maximum amount. Some people would only get 50, someone would get 75. So this actually could mean that you could be in an industry or a job where you got substantially lower pensions than somebody who did the same kind of job, but in a more priority industry. Like if you were a cleaner, you know, in a food factory versus in a coal mine, something like that, you would get a higher pension coming out of the coal industry because it was a priority industry. And lots of workers within the system are also given exemptions. So they get to exceed the cap, or they have bonuses that are built in for them, and they get to get, you know, their actual wages as opposed to the cap. But for most people, they get a percentage of up to 300 rubles, which is not a bad pension in the 1930s. By the time we get to the 1950s, inflation is going to have completely gutted that as an amount of money to live on. Many Soviet citizens are not covered by these policies, in particular the peasantry. They're going to be left out of the pension system until 1964. So for the vast majority of the Soviet period, in fact, most farmers, collective farmers, do not receive pensions. Instead, what they do, or what they're encouraged to do, is to set up these mutual aid societies where they sort of draw upon their own resources, and that's the thing that people are going to draw upon when they retire. In practice, this basically means that no peasant ever retires. They just work until they die, and that's the end of it. And a lot of them are very poor because there's not a lot of money to do this, and they're cut out of the system. If you worked for a state farm, it was a slightly different situation. You would be treated more like a worker, so you would get one of these other pensions, but at a lower norm. It was typically 85% of the norm that urban workers would get. So the system is very unequal, and then to add to that, you also have all kinds of special privileged pensioners in Soviet society. And the word they use for this is personal pensioners. So these are people who get a pension that's given to them it's a reward for them having done something notable or extraordinary. And it basically has no law governing. I mean, they eventually put some restrictions on this, but if you were somebody who, had been like a hero in some particular Civil War battle or something like this, you would then get a personal pension from either the local government or the union level government, and they would just give you an amount. It didn't have many rules or strings attached to it. And they keep these sort of proliferate, and this becomes a way of rewarding a lot of their most important allies. And they're very controversial, these pensions, but they become a huge drain on the budget, and they're still fighting to rein these in by the time the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Another thing I really want to emphasize here is that pensions, they're not given to the population, they're not given to the workforce, primarily as a way of making sure that they are material provision for, that this is about sort of socialist welfare. They are very explicitly in this period linked to productivity considerations. So they quickly become a kind of carrot and stick in the struggle for labor discipline. This is what they call it. Because one of the things that happens with the first 5-year plan with rapid industrialization in the Soviet Union is you have tons and tons of people, millions of people entering the workforce, but they've been peasants 10 minutes ago, and they're not particularly disciplined. They quit their jobs frequently. They move between jobs. And so something that you start to see in this early period, the early 1930s, is if you're somebody who moves around from job to job, if you're a job hopper, this is the expression they use. If you're one of these people, this actually really affects your ability to get a pension. They want people to be tied to one workplace, one industry, ideally for the rest of their working life. So this early period, they start to crack down on people who work somewhere long enough to kind of get on the pension system and then move on somewhere else. And one of the ways they do that is basically you need to have uninterrupted periods of labor to get a pension. It's not an amount that, because you don't pay into the pension, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. And then at the end of the day, as the sum total of every job you've had in your life, you have an amount of money that you've put into. No, it doesn't work like this. Your pension is given to you by the state in exchange for your kind of lifelong career of disciplined labor. So if you're somebody who moves around a lot, you break that period up and it can't be counted all together. You can't smash all those periods of labor together. So the continuous labor period, as they put it, becomes the kind of gold standard. You need this to get the pension and to get a good pension. So it's a very fragmented, very divisive, very kind of hierarchical pension system. And what changes really is the Second World War. So finally, more so than any kind of centralized top-down policy that the Soviet government puts in place, the war comes along, and with mass conscription, you have millions of soldiers who are conscripted into the Red Army. Many of them are going right out of high school to the front. Now there's more common terms for getting a pension from the state based upon military service. And that includes peasants. So the first peasants to get pensions, really, for the most part, they're people who get it because they were in the military. And the Soviet government really turns to pensions once again. Now it's not an incentive for your labor, but it's an incentive for you defending the fatherland, for going off and killing all the Germans, right? And their propaganda during World War II is very explicit that they're giving all this money to soldiers. You don't need to worry if you are injured in the war, your family will be taken care of. You will be compensated for if you lose the ability to work. This is what they tell them when they go off to the front. Of course, when they come back, it's a completely different story. So if you were a disabled person, if you were somebody, as they call it, it's a really hateful term. I don't like using it, but it's the word they use. They use invalid. This is the legal category in the Soviet Union. If you were an invalid of the Second World War, you have to consistently prove that you were injured on the front in battle. You have to do this yearly. Even if you had like an arm blown off or something like this, you would have to keep doing that to keep getting access to the pension money. Because the government is very worried in this moment that they've created this sense of entitlement amongst people who have been on the front, who are now claiming a lot of resources from them, which they don't frankly have. And so they want to incentivize people working. And the way that they do that is they shove the vast majority of people into the lowest category of invalid status, which requires you to work. And if you don't work, you don't get a pension. So very, very quickly, all of the generous promises that they had during the Second World War, they really get reeled in. And it comes back to this logic of working hard, productivity, your value to the state's overarching economic goals. So this system is not ideal by any means. Oh, and I should say there's one other thing I want to say about this, which is that while they're sort of reining in the pensions that they're giving out to people who were injured on the front, people who were in the Second World War, all of those personal pensioners are getting more money. Those kinds of privileges proliferate because they use this as a way to reward the people that they value the most. So technocrats, people who are involved in the Reconstruction effort, they get a lot of these kind of ad hoc personal pensions as opposed to the regular ones that go through the industrial labor system. By the late 1940s, everybody is rather aware within the Soviet government that this system is not ideal, to say the least. And moreover, more importantly, the money that people get in pensions is not enough money to live on. If you think back, I said that things were capped at a 300 ruble amount, right? So you would get maybe 50% of that. There's been massive inflation. You know, the cost of living's gone up to 15 times during the Second World War. They have a currency reform in 1947, and that reduces the value of cash in circulation by 10 times, but they don't adjust prices. So now the money in your savings account is worth 1/10 of what it was before, but everything costs the same. It's a way of trying to extract excess money out of the economy. This hits pensioners extremely hard. So if you were somebody who got a good pension in the 1930s, now your pension is basically not enough to live on. And in the meantime, again, there's all kinds of privileges that are being extended to the kinds of workers that they want to incentivize. So if they want to get people to go out to like the far north, they get higher pensions to do that, or the people who are in the most valued branches of industry. So this system it's very inefficient. It's also, it leads to all kinds of problems in terms of over and underpayment, because they have to do these kind of calculations of how long you were in the workplace and things like this. And it just really makes a lot of people unhappy. There are tons of people who grumble about this to Soviet authorities. This is one of my great surprises when I was digging around in the archives, is that there are literally thousands upon thousands of letters from people who are calling out the Soviet government for this. They're very unhappy about it. And of course, the other thing that happens then is that because if you don't get enough of a pension, you don't have enough money to live on, this also then overburdens other welfare organs of the Soviet government, because then those people show up petitioning to be given aid in an ad hoc way. Because another sort of interesting thing about the Soviet welfare system was that at every single level of the government, you could petition for what they called one-time monetary aid, where you would basically be given a lump sum of money because you would go in and tell a sad story, and and it was all in a very ad hoc way. And so they're very annoyed that people are not getting these pensions when they're showing up, and then they're claiming money from them in other ways, and they can't plan for how much money to put in circulation. Again, it's just not a very efficient system. So by the late 40s, everybody knows that this needs to be reformed. This system is just not going to last. And what's really interesting is that within most of the literature on Soviet history, the pension reforms are almost always associated with Nikita Khrushchev, not with Stalin. Because the main reform, which I'll talk about in a moment, it's done in 1956. But what people don't realize is that by the time we get to 1956, this is the product of at least 5 or 6 years of backroom deals, attempts to sort of get a new pension law written. And it's something that starts under Stalin, which is very interesting because Stalin at that time was very against reform. He basically said any kind of social reforms in the late 40s, we're not doing that. It's not the time to do it. We need to focus on the international situation. So what happened was that other members of the social welfare ministry organs, they basically planned this reform around him. And the Minister of Finance oversees this. And then after Stalin dies, there's a little bit of an opening to now actually enact it. So they put together a commission to study this problem in 1949. And over the next 4 years, they go back and forth, trying to figure out how they can rewrite the law, how they can actually centralize all of these various pension policies into one unified law. This is what they're looking to do. And they really struggle to do this because it still comes back to this question of incentives. They still fundamentally view the pension as a way to incentivize labor in the most important, the most valued branches of the economy. So the trade unions, for example, are very resistant to the idea of putting an upper cap on pensions for people who are in heavy industry, like metallurgy, things like this, because they want to incentivize labor. And then they go, well, okay, so they should be entitled to 1,500 rubles a month. And a food worker would be entitled to 300. So they go back and forth on this for years. And in the meantime, again, you have all these people who are really struggling to get by. The post-war years are extremely hard in the Soviet Union. You have a famine in 1947, another 1.5 million people die. You basically don't have running water in a lot of the major cities. The housing is overcrowded. There's, an epidemic of typhus, and people really don't have enough money to live on. And they're constantly writing in, again, they really are. And just to give you an example of some of the things that they're saying about the pensions in this period. So one person wrote in 1949 and said that they thought that the state's pension policy divided pensioners into beloved sons and neglected stepchildren. In other words, the people who get the highest pensions are the most valued, these industrial skilled workers, but everybody else is essentially left to rot. After Stalin dies in 1953, there's this kind of overall opening up in the public sphere. There's a little bit more openness. You can talk more freely about things that are wrong in Soviet society, because before that could potentially land you in prison. It still could afterwards, but it was less likely. The newspapers, the government organs are just absolutely flooded with people saying, you need to reform the pension laws. This is just not acceptable. And lots of people write in and you give them all kinds of heartbreaking stories about how, I used to work as a miner, but then I went and worked as a cleaner because I, developed pneumonia, and then I only get the cleaner's pension, not the miner's pension, because of a break in my employment, right? So they know they need to do something. And what ends up happening is this pension policy, this pension law reform sort of process that they've started, it ends up becoming a real political football in the post-Stalinist leadership. So I know no one in this room is an expert in Soviet history, but basically after Stalin dies, and if you've seen The Death of Stalin, the movie, you know this already, there's this back and forth, between like Malenkov and Khrushchev and Molotov, all these people who are like trying to take over Stalin's mantle. And believe it or not, though it is not covered in the Armand Iannucci film, pensions are a big part of the story, because they're all trying to be the ones who portray themselves as the guy who is not only going to take over Stalin's mantle, but who is going to bring prosperity to the Soviet people. Like, they're the ones who are going to complete all of these socialist reforms that have been sort of stalled out under Stalin. And so it goes back and forth between Malenkov and Khrushchev in particular. They're kind of, they're at sort of head to head on this issue. It becomes a football, it gets thrown back and forth between the two of them. And so in 1953, they come up with a new proposal after having gone back and forth on this issue of incentives. And they propose that what they're going to do is they're going to have workers each month pay 1% of their salary into a special fund that would go toward pensions. Instead of it coming from your industry, from your trade union, from central funds, workers will start to pay some of their own wages into their pensions. Sort of similar to a pay-as-you-go model. This is something we have all over the place, right? Where you pay a certain amount in, your employer matches it, or the state matches it, and that ends up being your pension at the end of the day. Because before in the Soviet system, it was all very state-driven. It was all top-down payments. This gets rejected. So this is the Malenkov plan. And part of it, I think, is that Khrushchev comes along, and in this kind of political contest over who's going to be the leader after Stalin's death and who's going to best defend the everyman's interests, Khrushchev says, we absolutely can never ask workers in a socialist system to pay into their own pensions. It has to come from the state. It's all about the state's largesse. So that plan gets thrown out, and instead Khrushchev embarks upon a new plan where workers are never going to be asked to pay into their own pensions. And the issue isn't going to come up again until we get to the Gorbachev years, which I'll talk about in a moment. So by 1956, they announced, this is just around the same time that that Khrushchev is kind of, he's edged out Malenkov. Malenkov gets, he gets exiled out to like Central Asia. I think he goes to Kazakhstan after he loses the battle with Khrushchev. Khrushchev assumes the sort of mantle of power. Most of you already know this. You have the 20th Party Congress. And at the 20th Party Congress, he says that Stalin committed all these great political crimes. He put a lot of great comrades in prison in the 30s. He possibly, incited Nazi Germany to attack the Soviet Union. These are all the things we remember about this speech. But in fact, actually, the bulk of the speech was about economic reforms, and a huge part of it was about pensions, again, because it was this thorn in their side still. So Khrushchev says we're going to have a new pension law. It's going to come out by the end of the year. And in May 1956, so on May 7th, they vote to support a new law, and they publish a draft of the new law on May 9th, 1956. So this is almost certainly a very symbolic move, having it on May 9th, because May 9th is the anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory in World War II. So by doing this, it's very much kind of a signal to war veterans in particular, to some of the people who were most affected by the war, that this new pension policy is going to improve their lives. It's going to, make up for some of the ways that they were neglected after the Second World War. And I don't want to go too much into all of the sort of nitty-gritties of this law, but there's a couple of main innovations that really I want to discuss, because they're going to be in place for the remainder of the Soviet period. They don't have many substantive changes to it after this. Essentially what this law does is it takes every single category of pensioner, with the exception of people who are in the Red Army, that's a separate, because it's military pensions, and government officials and scientists who are sort of top people, but the rest of people who would be pensioners, and it puts them all under one law. So you no longer have this fragmented system of, the textile workers' pensions or the food workers' pensions. They're all under one law. And in the preamble to this, it affirms to them that they will never, ever be asked to pay into their own pensions. A pension is always going to be something that you receive from the state with state funds. They create new minimums and maximums. So essentially that 300 ruble cap that I mentioned, that gets scrapped. And so it goes way higher. At this point, there's still a cap, but it's substantially more. It's more than double what it was before. They still don't let collective farmers into the pension system yet. It's not going to be till 1964 that they let them in. And part of that is because paying pensions to collective farmers is complicated, because collective farmers don't actually earn wages. They earn a very odd system of payment, which I'm happy to answer in questions if you want to ask me about, but it's so convoluted that I didn't want to bring it up here. But the other thing that they do is they confirm that the old rule of being allowed to retire at age 60 for men and 55 for women persists. And if you are somebody who has worked for at least 25 years in one industry, if you've had that continuous labor period, you get a substantial bonus. So you're going to get like it depends on your industry, but you're going to get a sort of substantial bump if you've done this. So it's, again, still fundamentally based on this idea of labor productivity and maximizing your lifelong contributions to the Soviet economy. So this law is very well received in Soviet society. People are legitimately grateful for it, because it's such a huge improvement over what happened before. And it has an immediate effect on people's living standards. Oh, sorry, this is just more pictures of propaganda. Anyway, yes, so you get lots of things like this, like tons and tons of these posters and discussions saying like, we're so grateful, the Soviet state cares so much about us. It dramatically increases the number of people who are on a pension, for one thing. So the eligibility of lots of people becomes much clearer, and they're able to get covered by this pension system. And so you have the number of pensioners going up dramatically, and you can take a look at the numbers here, as well as the average amount of a pension goes up dramatically. So from 155 rubles in October 1956 to 294 by the start of the new year. So it's almost doubling it, right? People get a lot more money out of this. And these are just the most basic pensions. If you were somebody who was entitled to the bonuses and all of this, it would go substantially up. The other thing that it does is it really increases the amount of money that's given to some of the most poorly paid pensioners. So in particular, you had a really big problem in the Soviet Union of people who had never worked, but who had gone straight out of high school into the Red Army and then went off to the front and then got injured and couldn't work. And so they didn't have wages to calculate a pension from. These people are now given a set minimum, so they don't just get a kind of symbolic gesture of like a handful of rubles, which often happened. They get a set minimum that's on par with the lowest minimums in any industry. So this is actually a big improvement for them. So the Soviet pension law of 1956, it is a very big improvement, and it also achieves a lot of the things that the Soviet government's been long claiming it wants to do. It's eliminating inequalities between pension policies, between pension amounts, it's rewarding people's labor, it's improving the lives of the socioeconomically vulnerable, and it's also sort of harmonizing the state's needs with the people's needs. But at the same time, as I would argue, it also set up a lot of problems going forward for the maturing Soviet state. And it was by no means a sort of comprehensive solution to many of its problems. So by focusing entirely or almost entirely on reducing the disparity in amounts, as opposed to thinking about what the prerequisites are for receiving care, saying it's just about kind of leveling things, evening out, tinkering with the numbers, rather than sort of fundamentally rethinking who deserves to get a pension in the society, it creates all kinds of cracks in the law that can easily be fallen through. So if you're somebody who took lots of time off from work because you had many children, that could actually totally mess up your chances of getting a good pension at the end of the day. Or if you were somebody who went to prison, they don't actually consider that to be something that you can count, even though you're in a labor camp and you are working. That is not the same labor toward your pension. And they don't have much clarity on what that means. And this is the Soviet Union. So millions of people have gone to the Gulag at this point, and it's not clear how they can use that time toward the pension. And when they go to calculate it at the end of the day, they're horrified to learn that, well, you got to take 5 years off because you were in jail, right? So there's all kinds of cracks you can fall through. As I said, they also don't bring collective farmers into the pension system, right? They kind of leave them outside of this until 1964. And when they bring them in, it's on a much more explicitly productivity considered sort of footing. They are very explicit that you get a pension if you are a good farmer who produces food, who produces more for the state. They don't even try to say this is about the state's largesse by that point. Finally, the other thing that this law does that they don't acknowledge publicly is it introduces a ton of money into the Soviet economy. This is kind of my interest in it because my larger book project is about money and communism. It introduces billions, literally billions of rubles into the Soviet economy that are completely unspendable. So on paper, it looks great. Your pension has doubled. You now get 300 rubles. But the state is not producing a sufficient amount of consumer goods for you to actually spend that on. So your nominal pension's going up, but the real value of that pension is rather low. And they don't really take this into adequate consideration when they formulate the law, because they're still it's the Soviet Union, they're still very focused on heavy industry, on military industry, things like this. They're not producing things for people to spend this money on. So there's still a kind of illusion of this improving. Finally, the other thing I want to say is that provision at the very beginning of the law that says that workers will never be asked to pay into their pensions, this is going to set up a budgetary crisis for the Soviet government by the time you get to the Gorbachev years. So what happens after this? Well, Khrushchev gets kicked out of office in 1964, and the guy over here on the left, Leonid Brezhnev, takes over. And Brezhnev basically does nothing to the system. He leaves it completely intact. He doesn't sort of raise it. He kind of just leaves it. This is a great accomplishment, and it's done. And interestingly enough, the Brezhnev years are, they're often, we think of them as the period of stagnation, but it's really worth remembering that the term stagnation was applied retroactively by Gorbachev. At the time, the 1970s were a great time to live in the Soviet Union, perhaps the best time to live in the Soviet Union, because this is around the time that the Soviet government taps into its vast oil reserves. And they're able to sell oil abroad and then take the revenue from that and plug holes in the budget that let them continue to fund this very sort of generous welfare system, right? So there's not enough money going into the system from the system itself, but they're able to move the budget around to make it look like they still can. And so this is the system that persists through until we get to the 1980s, when Gorbachev finally takes over and openly admits by 1980 that growth in the Soviet Union, economic growth, has hit 0%. that the economy is in stagnation, and that all of these kind of budgetary maneuvers that they've been doing behind the scenes are masking an economy that's totally in shambles, that's on the verge of collapse. So Gorbachev tries to launch some reforms, and in particular, he tries to go back to that system that Malenkov had originally proposed, the system of having workers pay at least a tiny percentage into their own pensions, and he writes a law on that. But of course, the Soviet Union collapses before that can be changed. The law never goes into effect. So the pension reforms of 1990, they go nowhere. And instead, what ends up happening, oh, sorry, I don't want to go that far yet. What ends up happening is the Soviet Union, you know, as it collapses in 1991, it turns into the successor states, and the Russian Federation sort of, it assumes much of the state sort of apparatus of the Soviet government, but it becomes, it's not a nation state, but it's kind of its own federal structure. It transitions very abruptly to a market economy. I mean, overnight, their price controls are released, all kinds of the subsidies that the Soviet government had been using, not just for pensions, but for prices for education, for the hospital system, all of this is removed when they're trying to move toward a free market system. And this is the net effect of really hitting pensioners hard, because those pensions, which had been enough to live on in the Soviet period, now are pennies. They're not even remotely close to enough money to live on, because prices are now going to fluctuate and they go up. They remove the price controls in 1992, and the price of everything just goes sky high. And so you have a lot of sad stories in the 90s of pensioners who are begging on the streets or who starved to death. You know, really, pensioners, I can't stress this enough, pensioners, the disabled, people who are on any kind of state benefits in the Soviet Union, they suffer extreme poverty in this period, which helps to explain, I would argue, some of the popularity of one Vladimir Putin, who comes to power in 2000 saying that he's going to clean up this mess, that he is going to get the Soviet welfare system back up and running to a certain extent, and that he's going to stabilize everything, he's going to improve living standards. And you know, there are so many things to criticize him for, but one thing that we can't criticize him for necessarily is that when he comes to power, he does successfully do this in his first presidency. So he eliminates a lot of pension arrears. So one of the things that had happened was that because you know, a lot of the local governments basically ran out of money. They just couldn't pay pensions anymore. They stopped paying people's pensions. They pay a lot of the arrears to people. So they get a kind of chunk of change that, you know, that will make up for the fact that they haven't been receiving a pension for several years. And he moves the pension system over onto a more sustainable pay-as-you-go model. The other thing he does is he creates a stabilization fund. So this is basically how the current government has been able to stave off economic collapse, because, you know, since 2014 there have been all kinds of sanctions, the economy's been under strain, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they have this big amount of money, and they keep, well, it's an investment they keep in multiple currencies. And so when the ruble starts to tank, they buy bad rubles with good euros. And so he creates this fund. The stabilization fund allows them to kind of always be able to subsidize certain aspects of their social welfare policy by taking money out of that fund. This is one thing that Putin did. So he creates a pay-as-you-go system. And essentially the way that this works, it's not that everyone's going to be in the pay-as-you-go model. People who were born before 1967, they're going to continue to get essentially the old state-paid policy, so state-paid pensions. Everybody else pays into their own pension. And that was the system that was in place until 2 years ago, really. They went into effect last year, when they finally admitted that even that system was in collapse in Russia. And so part of the problem, as I said, is that the Russian government, the economy has been under a lot of strain since 2014, since they annexed Crimea, and they have been suffering economic sanctions since that. It's really restricted their ability to get into, you know, to get loans from other governments, things like this. And also because they self-imposed sanctions on food products, which has put the cost of living up. And also the other thing that's in the background of all of this is that the international prices of oil have tanked of late, and that's the big export of Russia still to the present day. So they admitted a couple of years ago that essentially there is no money for the pension system anymore. In fact, the Prime Minister Medvedev said basically, like, hang in there, pensioners, like we'll fix it, we'll get there. But for now, there's gonna need to be some sacrifices. And so in 2018, right on the heels of the Olympics, they banned any discussion was it the Olympics or the World Cup? World Cup, sorry, the World Cup. They banned any discussion of this while this was going on. But after that, they pushed through really controversial legislation that would reduce pensions, that would more importantly increase the age of retirement. So recall I said that that was set in 1930, and that limited your pension, it set your age of retirement at 60 for men and 55 for women. They wanted to increase that so that women would retire at 63 and men would retire at 65. And people were really furious about this because the average life expectancy for a Russian man is 57. So the ability to actually cash in on a pension is rather uncertain for most of them. And this was one of the first times actually that many people across every sort of walk of Russian life were out in the streets protesting, like little old ladies were out in the streets protesting. And I like this picture because you see like you've got Vladimir Putin in the middle, you've got the head of the central bank there and other deputies who voted for the reform. And people were really out there. This is one of the first times that Putin's popularity in any poll really took a dip. A visible dip because people were so furious, but they pushed through this reform. So now actually the age of retirement has been raised. So just to sum all of this up, I would say that pensions really, they became a key pillar of Soviet welfare policy, but this was far from an entitlement for most of the Soviet period. And the process of getting pensions at all was actually a very fraught process. It was a very hard-won victory in the Soviet context. It's something that took decades to be accomplished, and it was really bound up in the victory of World War II, sort of the moral victory of World War II. So it took a long time for this to happen. And the promise of financial stability, it really was something that was held out as one of the great guarantees of Soviet socialism, one of the best things about being a Soviet citizen. It gets written into the 1977 Constitution that everyone has the right to material security in old age, all these kinds of things. But again, it was a very exclusionary and paternalistic system in practice. It was much more focused on productivity considerations, and lots of people ended up being kept out of this system. Now, a lot of people, because there's still a great deal of nostalgia for the Soviet period in the Russian Federation, they look back on this very fondly. They think this was a time when everyone was taken care of, and we had this inviolable guarantee to a pension. And now a lot of people are very worried that they either won't live long enough to earn a pension to see that, or the money simply won't be there when they come of pension age. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. Okay. And this is Khrushchev enjoying his pension after he was kicked out of office.